This is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today we're talking about one of the medical issues that students bring into their Alexander Technique lessons that creates some additional challenges to how they organize themselves and how they can find easeful movement. And that's hypermobility. Now, I personally have hypermobility. This is one I know really well. I first had my first symptoms of hypermobility problems in my early teens. I was about 12 or 13 when this started for me. So I have a good 20 odd years of experience with this. I have a lot to say. I'm going to try to keep this fairly short and not really digging much into my own story and my progress with my own stuff. And I'm going to talk a little bit more instead about how does that work within the context of an Alexander Technique lesson in particular. What do we avoid? What do we encourage? So, hypermobility can be a bit of a misnomer for a lot of people. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're hyperflexible. Hypermobility comes from a connective tissue disorder. So we need to first all get kind of on the same page with what does that mean and what does that cause in order to say, okay, how do we work with this? The reason it's important to know how do we work with this is hypermobility is actually just about the only diagnosis that I can think of that I've certainly ever worked with that fundamentally changes how we as Alexander Technique teachers work with the student. Absolutely, if someone has had like a particular injury or if they're under movement limitations from doctor or physical therapy orders, yeah, we work with those and follow those instructions to the letter. But that doesn't fundamentally change how we work with the person. It just limits what activities we can do and what kind of ranges of motion we're working with, that kind of thing. Hypermobility, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome in particular, is one of the few things that does fundamentally change how we need to work with a student. And I know that because I have it. So, you have different types of tissues in your body. We've got bones, we've got muscles. Connective tissue is stuff like cartilage, ligaments, tendons, fascia, that kind of thing. One of the main components of that, the protein itself that builds those, is collagen. Now, collagen has become somewhat of a buzzword in the last 10, 15 years of a lot of people saying oh, you just need to take more collagen supplements. Okay, that doesn't work for this. And frankly, doesn't work for really much of anybody because that's not how our bodies process these proteins and rearrange them elsewhere. So, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is a genetic disorder that impacts my DNA structural instructions for how to connect collagen proteins and how to build the actual collagen protein structures. It's not a lack of collagen. I don't need more. Taking more of it is not going to do anything because my body is still going to then reassemble those incorrectly at the places where I actually need to have repair to damage done to my collagen. There are tons of different types of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and hypermobility in general. I am very lucky that I have a mild to moderate case. I don't have really many skin symptoms. My skin doesn't come apart super easily. I don't have the vascular or internal organ issues. I don't have internal ruptures or anything like that. Those are much more severe versions of this stuff, but it still comes from these problems with how are collagen proteins structured. So, when we're dealing with something like a connective tissue disorder, we actually might not be able to use the sort of standardized Alexander Technique language and directions maybe at all, because a lot of them direct away from the core. Neck and head up, widening, lengthening, knees out, directing out. Up until around 10 to 20 years ago, barely anybody had any experience with hypermobility or any knowledge of what it is. It is now luckily starting to be more common and people have a little bit better awareness of it, including within the Alexander Technique community. There are quite a few people, including myself, who either have hypermobility or have quite a good bit of experience working with it. One of the nice things about teachers in the Denver area, because this is where I live and where I went to school for my Alexander Technique teacher training, is a lot of the people around here have experience with hypermobility because they had to learn to work with me. So if you're around the Denver area, a lot of them have worked with me and can work safely with hypermobility. So the fundamental differences in working with a hypermobile person versus someone who's not hypermobile is in how do we direct. Instead of directing for lengthening and going away from the core, I find that my best use of myself comes from directing in. That basically creates reassurance on a neurological level, on a muscular level, that I'm not going to come apart. I'm okay. Here's that connection. I have that soft nestle connection between my neck and my head, between my ears and behind my nose. And that actually creates the secondary effect of lengthening and widening. So the way that I think of it is this. With hypermobility, we've got some prerequisites that we need to first get a handle on. Before we can think about letting go at all, we need to first stick with connection and safety and reassurance. So my main directions that I use, and that I also use with students who are hypermobile, and frankly also I find this really helpful with students who have anxiety as well, is to talk with connection language. So the kind of classic phrasing for lengthening, widening instructions is a 4-part series. Let the neck be free, to let the head go forward and up, to let the back lengthen and widen, to let the knees go forward and away. That's the kind of classic phrasing. It's well over 100 years old at this point. And for some people it works great. I do use that with my students, some of them. But I consider that to be just one tool in my toolkit of ways that I can work with a student. And I know that with firsthand experience because I can't use those directions. The challenge for an Alexander Technique teacher in doing that is we basically have to run 2 sets of directions at once. And that's hard. It's really difficult. My teacher training was more difficult than it was for other people because of my hypermobility. Because if I say a direction to my student who is not hypermobile, I can't think that direction in myself. And it is really hard to run 2 sets of directions at the same time to say, I want you to lengthen, and I'm using my hands and thinking lengthening in the student, but in myself I'm thinking connection and not allowing lengthening to become problematic for me. So that's the challenge. I would encourage any Alexander Technique teachers who are watching this to try connection language for yourself and see what happens. I found that there are some students who have a negative result from thinking connection language, but honestly it's pretty rare. I use connection language with folks who have anxiety, folks who have tremors, folks who have a tendency to just be kind of ready to go all the time. I find that connection language can just be really helpful for kind of de-escalating that and providing some of that embodied reassurance that you're still here, your body's not going anywhere. I find it makes a big difference. So, for anyone who is thinking about taking Alexander Technique lessons who has hypermobility, particularly Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, talk to your teacher first. Don't just walk in there and assume that because they're an Alexander Technique teacher that they can work with you safely. It's honestly not true, and I have found that firsthand. I have had some bad experiences with it, and I've also had absolutely magical, life-changing experiences with it. So it depends on the person. It really depends on the teacher and how open they are. My practice is called Open Mind Alexander Technique for a reason. Not everybody is trained to think of their directions as just part of a toolkit and that they're going to select different tools for different people. Some teachers do think of it as what I have to offer is how I direct myself, and that's it, because I can't give anything else. And I get that on an academic level. Like I totally understand, and if that's what you want to offer, then that's what you offer. Cool. For me, there is more than one human, so there's more than one way for a human to direct themselves. I've found that when I work with a new person, a new Alexander teacher, fully certified, this isn't like a trainee teacher or anything, the first couple times that I work with them, I say, just don't touch my head. It's not going to work, because we're so strongly trained in our teacher training to direct the head up that it makes my head to neck connection just lose everything. I feel like a Pez container. You know those old Pez candies that had like the plastic thing and then you hit a button and the head pops off? That's what it feels like if someone puts their hands under the bottom of my skull in particular and directs up. It makes me feel like I'm flying across the room. It's so uncomfortable, and I'll have neurological symptoms for potentially hours after that. That happened a couple times when I was in training, and it's very uncomfortable, and it's definitely a strong negative experience, and it's something to be avoided. So instead, connection. In the future, I'm going to have probably several videos on tips from my 20 plus years of experience living with hypermobility and working with Alexander Technique within that, on how can hypermobile people find a bit more ease without having to just constantly hold themselves in place all the time. One of the areas that this can come up with in particular is with things like the shoulder joints. So on me, with my level of hypermobility and what I've got going on, if I lean forward and tilt and don't keep enough connection between my arm and my shoulders will actually start to dislocate under their own weight. They won't come out all the way. It's not a full dislocation. It's called a subluxation. It's uncomfortable, it's scary, and it creates damage. It's like stretching out a rubber band too many times. The rubber band eventually is going to sustain structural damage, and unfortunately I can't just switch mine out. So instead of directing out with my arms, I direct in. My directions for my arms are exclusively in connection. So when I do something like this, to say hang up some clothes, I had a video on that a couple weeks ago, I'm actually thinking arms in for myself. And that's quite different than how I would recommend someone work with that who is not hypermobile. So there's all sorts of different things that you can do with that. There are different Alexander Technique teachers who kind of specialize in this stuff. Anne Rodiger in New York City is one of them. I've gone to one of her workshops before and talked with her a little bit. She's great. Definitely a safe person to work with. So it's certainly something to be aware of if you want to work with Alexander Technique, and if you're looking for lifestyle improvements for your hypermobility, absolutely Alexander Technique can help with the right teacher. So ask questions, communicate, be open. Ask if a teacher has worked with connection language, if they're open to working with connection language, if they're open to, for example, watching this video or looking at some of Anne Rodiger's stuff that she's got online. Those are all resources for Alexander Technique teachers to look into. So I hope this was a helpful look into hypermobile Alexander Technique. And in the future, I'll have a whole bunch of tips, good stuff that I've picked up over the years that have really vastly improved my quality of life.